Hello, everyone. This is Nitin Raizada. I welcome you all in the panel discussion on innovation in patient access programs, boosting customer experience. I think this topic is something which has gained a lot of importance over the last few years with the emergence of specialty pharma, rare drugs, orphan drugs, more and more specialized and novel therapies that have come to the market. Patient access has become the holy grail that everybody wants to solve, and this happens to be an area which is right at the center of healthcare, where the payer, the pharmacy, the provider, and the pharma industry have equal stakes. Everybody is trying to solve this puzzle, and there is a significant amount of conversation, investment, experiments that are being developed as we speak today. I have a very interesting panel. I have a panel with distinguished members from the payer industry, the provider industry, and from pharma experience as well. And I believe that the conversation would be very interesting as we would hear, our customer stakeholders, what do they feel as pharma makes investments in patient access across the board. I will give a quick perspective on the type of discussion that we're going to have. I'll set the agenda for that. I'll invite then the speakers to introduce themselves, talk about their own point of view on this topic, and we will go into a panel conversation from there. Last 10 years, I have seen that, the entire patient access area has become more and more important. And, today we are seeing on one side, consumers, whether these are HCPs or these are caregivers or patients themselves, they expect a consumer grade experience. But on the other side, we have increased regulation, we have increased scrutiny on the kind of things that are available to execute in the market. We are looking at digital transformation helping us in many, many ways in terms of how we can reach the patient, how we can engage with the different stakeholders. But at the same time, the kind of experience that we are delivering in the market leaves a lot on the table. There's a lot of expectation, but I think there's a lot of gap between what is expected and what we are able to deliver in the market. There's significant amount of data also. So today, some of you who would have participated in the previous conversations, we are seeing a large ecosystem emerge. So there are a lot of new members in the healthcare community, patient communities, wellness organizations, digital health platforms, in addition to what used to be the traditional payer provider, pharmacy and pharma world. And therefore, there's been a lot of talk about the use of ecosystem. But then how do we make all that happen within the workflow that a patient or a provider is using is also a critical aspect. So those are some of the topics that we are going to look at today in the conversations. I have a few questions, but before we go into the panel discussion, let's go through a round of introduction with the panel members. Maria, let's start with you and we'll go over the table again.
Thank you so much, and it's really a pleasure to be with this distinguished panel. Maria Lopes, I'm an OBGYN by training. I've been on the payer side for the past 23 years, multiple regional organizations along the way, as well as a national PBM in the role of Chief Medical Officer, and now work in the area of innovation, quality, formulary, and policy development and implementation. So pleasure to be with the panel.
Thanks. Thank you, Maria. Bill, I have known you for a while. You've had a very interesting journey. Let's hear it from you.
Thank you, Nitin. It's great to be here with everybody today. As Nitin said, I have had an interesting journey. I am currently the Chief Growth and Strategy Officer for Solus. It's the nation's largest independent women's imaging company. So a provider doing a lot of great work. But my career in healthcare over many years has been focused on innovation, digital transformation. I've led businesses in price transparency, digital access, worked across payers and providers. So I think that unique perspective, I look forward to today's discussion.
Wonderful. And Mila, you also have a mix of experiences. Let's hear it from you.
Sure. So Mila Maloney, I work as the Chief Commercial Officer for Premier Applied Sciences. We are the data and research division of Premier. I've been here for about 5 years, and prior to this, I spent 16 years at Merck & Company doing a variety of roles. So happy to be here today.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks for the introductions. I have a set of questions that I'll take through the tape through this entire period. We have about 40 minutes in which we'll have a discussion, and then about 10 minutes where we'll try and answer some audience questions. So when it comes to patient access, we know that hospitals, payers, they are taking their own approaches. They are themselves trying to make that happen. They are creating different digital platforms. They are enabling services. And then there is life sciences, which is also trying to introduce its own patient access services, right? And how do you think, these merge together? Do you think there is friction between them, or do you think they can cross leverage each other? So we can go one by one. Dr. Maria, let's start with you, hear it from you, and then we'll go over the table.
Yes, and I think they're somewhat, I would say that we're far from integration. I think that each stakeholder is still trying to develop solutions within their silo, if you will. And so my hope is that we'll bridge some of those gaps in terms of how do we mutually collaborate for the benefit of the patient at the center. I think affordability is starting to be a bigger and bigger challenge. I think that reflects on benefit designs and challenges around patient, co-pays and co-insurance. And I think what pharma and industry is trying to do to mitigate for some of those challenges. I think often hub services, there's an incredible opportunity sometimes to do a better job in terms of connecting with providers and even being able to share data that's meaningful and actionable. So there's certainly a plethora of options that I think we can think about where working together, I think, matters, including looking at setting of care in terms of not only patient affordability, but convenience, ease of access, scalability. I think COVID has taught us that home is a third locus of care, and how we can certainly think about telehealth and more solutions to be able to administer complex treatments in the home setting. And finally, data, the power of data in helping us to innovate and being directional in terms of customer centric and being able to offer, solutions that really mean something, I think, to patients, but also that are solving for solutions in the industry relevant to payers and providers as well.
I agree, and I think that's a very important perspective. I'm sure that our colleagues are taking note of that. Bill, what do you see from your perspective, having spent time with both payer and provider and setting up similar systems?
Well, I think first and foremost is that dependency on the different stakeholders. So even at the point of care and in the provider setting, the reality is that data and decisions that the payer makes have a huge impact as to whether or not a patient has access to programs and treatments, and certainly the role of the manufacturer in that. So I see all these things coming together, but the reality for much of the provider community is this imperative to continue to be more efficient and to maintain systems and to maintain a level of productivity and performance that oftentimes crowds out the ability to adopt new innovation and to pursue programs that are oftentimes in the best interest of moving the industry forward. Certainly bright spots, but I do see those challenges, Nitin.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I agree. I think one of the biggest challenges, how do we, there is the EHR fatigue, there's data fatigue already in the provider systems, and then you introduce another program. How do you make them use this new thing? Mila, from your perspective, how do you see this intersection going?
I think what's complicated everything are two things. One is the amount of information that's coming at these providers. They say there's 36,000 studies published every single year. You could read one a day and you'd get to not even 1%. So how do you keep up with that? And these new novel therapies get multiple indications every year. How do you keep up with that? So that's part of it. But then our patients are so savvy. They're reading things on their own. They're figuring it out. They're trying to determine their own ROI. So copay cards just aren't enough anymore. You've got to figure out how you reconcile the amount of information being thrown at the patients and the providers and how that comes together to the right treatment option for them.
Yeah. So I think that's that's something that we got discussed in the other panel discussion as well, where we're talking about there's a lot of information, in fact, a lot of misinformation, and how do you counter that? But the other important topic that we have talked about is that while manufacturers are investing, pharma being a significant stakeholder in the overall care journey, has invested a lot of resources in helping create these patient access programs. But there's a lot of manual work that happens in the healthcare today. There's a lot of crisscross, very diverse electronic infrastructure that the provider community, the payer community has. And in this whole situation, there are a lot of limitations that companies face in terms of integrating their own programs with what's already there. So what do you think would be the strategies that pharma can adopt in this crisscross situation, where on one side there is a need to integrate, but on the other side the physical reality is making it more and more difficult? What would be the approach that a pharma company can take, in your opinion?
I can start. And I think that, as a payer, my, in terms of thinking of pharma, is that they should deliver value, right? And value is usually clinical differentiation, it's tying efficacy and safety, it's clinical innovation, and it's, usually it's efficacy and safety divided by cost. And so many times at the time of launch, I would say that's kind of just the beginning in terms of telling the story of value. So over time, what I think we're expecting more and more of pharma, and especially now with gene therapies, CAR-Ts, complex regimens that are very high cost and sometimes only one-time treatments, it's the ability to tell the story of how is it impacting patient journey, how is it impacting other cost offsets, how is it improving function and patient quality of life, is it extending survival? And if there are other treatment options, how this novel treatment compares with other treatment options. So again, it's a story of how strong the data is at launch, your indication, the route of administration, all the things that we're so used to reviewing, but going beyond that in terms of real differentiation and true innovation, how it's making an impact in terms of total cost of care as well.
Well, and I would just to build on that point, what's interesting right now is we've seen with the 21st Century Cures Act and a number of industry regulations requiring patient data to be made available by payers and providers in a way that can be consumed digitally. And so here we have under the currents a major transformation in our industry that's really just beginning. So as I think about all of those critical points on showing value, and then the question comes back to the teams, well, how do we get at that data? How do we do that? It's going to become easier. Now it'll be done on behalf of the patient, but this is going to change a number of ways at which our industry approaches this critical question.
I also think you have to think about then how you operationalize it. I agree with Maria that you've got to have the value data, and I agree with everything Bill said. And I think on top of that, you have to think about how the system's actually going to do it. So I think back to my Merck days, and we launched a product and we came in 30% lower than the market leader, but they said it was going to cost them 40% to make a conversion. So even though we were less expensive and we had great data, the cost to convert was higher. And I think we saw that with the biosimilars. Most systems have done an analysis to know exactly how much lower it has to come in order for it to be worth their while to make that change. So you've got to have a clinical profile that makes sense with the value to get a seat at the table, but you also have to have a way that the system can actually use your product, convert to it, figure out where it fits, and identify patients to give it to.
Mm-hmm. So that brings another interesting perspective. And I was talking to someone very recently, right? So from a manufacturer perspective, right, while, of course, payer providers, all of the other constituents in the market have evaluated us on efficacy, safety, pricing, and stuff like that. But now with the emergence of patient services, where pharma is wanting to provide or is willing to provide services right? Which can be additional data, remote monitoring, in certain cases, transportation services, etc. Right? So they are wanting to become an equal participant in the overall care process. Do you see that trend in your experience, and what's your perspective on that? Dr. Maya, let's start with you.
Yeah, what I'm seeing now is the emergence of patient-reported outcomes, how that integrates into value. Maybe also it could be quite actionable, right? If, certain patient symptoms actually mean that a drug's working better or a drug's not working. How you tie that to outcomes, I think, is a fascinating question, especially in areas like IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, and maybe RA and other chronic conditions. What's the role of shared decision-making in that process, as well as we look to adherence and longer term implications in terms of outcomes? The role of the digital transformation as well. We're seeing now digital therapeutics either be complementary to pharmacological therapies or perhaps even be a substitute in some cases for pharmacologic therapy. So fascinating area in terms of how we think about patient engagement and integration of especially digital therapeutics, right? What is their role in the future, and who's the right patient? I love what Mila said in terms of who's the right patient for which these work particularly well. So I think these are all, again, part of innovation in terms of, I think, what we're going to see in the future.
Interesting. And Mila, your perspective, you being from the pharma background, what do you think are the challenges, barrier for pharma's patient programs?
I think that you just have to be able to think like the health system in terms of their workflow and how you embed it. There's lots of different programs out there that already exist. I know a lot of times the pharma companies also want to create their own, but that is a whole nother technology set that the health system then has to use. So I think if you can really just think to yourself, how is it the health system deals with this patient? What is the flow? What's the interaction going to look like? If we find them and decide on a therapy, then what? And all of those things will help to integrate it. We have a technology that is an EHR alert, and we were looking at creating this alert for a certain type of oncology patient. And what we realized in the process is by the time the alert fired, the patient would be gone, because when the information was entered in the system was after the patient left. So now you've got to try to bring them back in to then talk to them about their therapeutic options. And so we realized in order to be successful, we actually had to come out of the EHR and find a way to notify providers. And that's what I mean when I say think like the health system, understand the flow of the patient and when they're going to be intercepting with them and when they can actually have a meaningful dialogue with them.
Brilliant point. I agree with you completely. Bill, I'm sure from your current experience, you would have things to add here.
Well, I would definitely put an exclamation point on that, working within the hospital and the provider's workflow and their context and reality. That's certainly the current horizon where we are. But I would also say looking out beyond over the next 12, 24, 36 months, the reality is there's a major, to that digital transformation point, there's new stakeholders that have relationships with patients, and they're growing quite dramatically. Companies that we use every day from a health and wellness standpoint that are making really big bets to take a broader and more central role in the care of their consumers. And so I see these new entry points, and you can see this rise of third parties that are helping to navigate and advise patients in their journey, and they're being empowered with data that they didn't have but 12, 24 months ago. So that's going to change the landscape. So my point here is to focus on both horizons.
Wonderful. So I'll switch tracks and I'll come to another aspect of the patient access. Outcome-based contracts, right? The emergence of this topic within healthcare has been there for a while, and we are seeing more and more therapies, more and more care perspectives getting into the outcome-oriented contracts, which means that you require now a lot of data of how patients are doing within the therapy, the requirement for reimbursement, we are seeing drug companies rely on hub services. Now, from your perspective, how have you seen hubs driving? Are they helpful in driving this entire outcome-based contract paradigm? What are the areas that you see still need improvement? As we enter into more and more outcome-based healthcare contracts.
Yeah, I'll start with them. I think if these were easy, we'd have a lot more shining examples, but they're not easy. I think that, we many times start with how do we define success and what's the measure of success? What's the timeline in which we can measure, if we can measure easily, what are the biometrics that define what success even means? And so we get hung up, this is a great, topic, but we get hung up on the details, and rightly so, because the details matter in terms of operationalizing some of these agreements. And many times we start talking about outcomes and we end up talking about the things we can measure, like adherence, for example, or an LDL level, because it's easy to obtain that measure. And so I think, part of the exercise, and I think we're going to have to figure this out. There's over 200 gene therapies in the pipeline. There's more, we now have 4 CAR-Ts, that are available. So I think we have to figure this out, especially around these one-time treatments, because if they're not about a cure, about success, what are they about? So I think we do have to figure it out, but we almost need like a third party. And I think this is more than just one health plan at a time. I think that, usually payers are very, challenged by adverse selection. And so I think this should be part of innovation in terms of multi-payer effort, or certainly part of, CMS innovation in terms of how we figure these out, how we roll these out successfully, who's capturing the data. And then, how are we defining success in terms of the timeline that I think can only elevate, the innovation and the perception around these incredible, treatments that are coming down the pike. But there's several different models, and some are a lot easier to implement than others. Maybe the concept of risk pools is easier, or something like reinsurance may be easier. I do think, though, that maybe some of these examples where it may be easier is not really solving for the affordability problem or telling a value story.
Bill, your perspective on this?
I would share that the points on the challenge of implementing these structures, and from 2 standpoints, it creates an incentive to expand the role, which can often be challenging, thinking about the role of the healthcare provider and stakeholders, manufacturer, and how that comes together in the construct of the outcome-based agreement. So that's a challenge. But I also think when you look at it, any given provider is dealing with hundreds of payer contracts and different permutations. So the operational challenge of managing across all of these different mechanisms becomes really daunting and requires a significant amount of infrastructure. So how do we address that imperative in the context of these structures?
Yep, and Myla, have you had experience on managing these type of contracts? We are seeing a lot of pharma products getting into this particular space. What's been your perspective on this? Myla, we can't hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. Sorry about that. So I actually have a lot of experience from a provider standpoint. There are a ton of value-based contracts either being contemplated or being executed with health systems directly, because they're a payer too. Even if the health system gets reimbursed, if it's not under a DRG, they still have to pay for it up front and then hope the reimbursement happens later. And it may not be at the full % of what they paid for the product. So they want to get involved in these value-based contracts. And what's interesting is that the outcomes are related to things that are so complex, like length of stay. I was talking to one of my subject matter experts in this at a health system, and he said to me, If I implemented every value-based contract that came to me that reduced length of stay, I'd have nobody in my hospital. Because if you added them all up, there should be nobody in his hospital based on how many days of stay that would have been reduced. So we know that isn't true. And so I think we're really stuck in this paradigm of figuring out, how do we measure what's important from a patient standpoint, but also what is reasonable to actually get implemented and measured from a health system standpoint? And of course, then how do you layer in the payer contract? Because all the stakeholders should be involved. If you're going to do a value-based contract, it should be a payer, it should be a provider, because if you just incent one, the other isn't going to be involved or potentially not be incented to want to help do it.
Right. No, so that presents a very interesting construct, and that's where I think the push and pull in this whole environment comes in. So let's move to another important aspect. The entire focus is on patient affordability and better access to medication, but we have significant barriers, right? Formulary exclusions, high deductible plans that are becoming more and more popular, and therefore this whole aspect of out-of-pocket expense for the patient, that becomes a barrier for the patient in accessing medication or therapies. What do you think are the best ways for pharma to facilitate better patient affordability? Myla, let's start with you this time, and then we'll go around the table.
I think one of the areas I hear more and more, and we're trying to figure out how to help, is in social determinants of health. I mean, already patient affordability is an issue, but then when you layer healthcare disparities on top of it, it's more than just the cost of the product. It's, can they afford transportation to even go to their visit for follow-up? So even if they're taking the medicine and there's no follow-up, then how do you know if the medicine's working, or how do you adjust it? Or if you want to layer in healthy habits, if they don't have accessibilities to sidewalks to walk or healthy foods, then a lot of the medications on their own won't be enough. So there's just so much to that. So I think when you're trying to figure out the right program, you have to layer in that not all patients look alike when they walk out of the door of that healthcare system.
Agree. I think social determinants is a big area of focus for pretty much all constituents within healthcare. Bill, you had a significant amount of exposure to this price transparency and access problem. What's your perspective? What's your experience in this area?
Well, it is an enormous problem because there's so much complexity underneath the pricing schemas across the industry. And as I think many are aware, there's been a number of regulatory pushes to make price transparency actionable and understandable and real, because it would reflect actual contracted negotiated rates, which is certainly a major step forward from previous efforts. And from the consumer standpoint, welcome. It's one of the top problems when we survey healthcare consumers, understanding what their financial responsibility is prior to undertaking a treatment or a service. So I think generally there's a huge unmet need, and that will take a number of years of continued effort. So making that information available at the decision point is critical. But the other side of it too is really the increasing role of providers in the financial health of their patients. And we've seen through investments to a certain extent in financial counselors and other programs which have been really undertaken within the revenue cycle and financial departments. That's been a major source of energy and a need, because I think we'd all recognize that affordability crisis for most consumers just requires a broader role for the healthcare provider to play in that.
Interesting. Dr. Maya, what's your perspective on this?
Great comments, and I wholeheartedly agree with both panelists. Just also add, as we emerge into more shared agreements, right, accountable care organizations, and focus on total costs, the more it becomes evident that we can't just look at silos. And so if I'm increasing spend on the pharmacy side, what am I getting in return in terms of offsets on the medical side in terms of total costs? I think that's very much part of the value story. A couple of other things. One is this concept of waste, right? How do we also think about waste in the sense that patients may start a treatment and then abandon it, especially, if you have a copay accumulator situation, patients may not see much cost, and at some point they will. and they have to abandon the treatment. And we're totally misaligned. I have to say that for some lower cost drugs, also without patient support, patients may actually see a higher cost than for the higher cost drugs. So, some of these areas really have to be solved for.
Yeah, I think you point to some very significant problems that we see a lot of conversation around. The other issue that we see is, and that was again a topic of discussion in our previous conversation. With COVID hopefully coming to an end or at least slowing down, we will start seeing people go back to offices to meet with their doctors in person. The volumes are going to increase. And there is already EHR fatigue. There are so many systems that the doctor offices are using today. And in that comes in pharma programs, right, who expect you to use another digital platform, log into another system to start a patient journey and stuff like that. Where do you see manufacturers can step up to help the provider systems and other stakeholders within healthcare? That's a question that keeps coming back. We're trying to solve that puzzle for our clients in the pharma manufacturing space. What's your perspective there? Bill, let's start with you.
Well, I think this is an area ripe for innovation because at the end of the day, it's a lot of the data that resides in those provider systems and payer systems that are necessary for the workflow and applications for a variety of programs. So how can the manufacturer, on behalf of the consumer or the provider, access that data and remove workflow steps that are currently on the shoulders of the provider or on the shoulders of a third party? There's a lot that can be done there that I think, first generation systems within the provider organizations weren't set up to do that. But with a transformation towards more of an API based IT infrastructure, it opens up these avenues. And I think this is a great area for manufacturers to innovate and drive forward a better approach.
Wonderful. Yep. Myla, from your standpoint, what would you see as what's manufacturers trying to do to help their customer in this journey?
The ones that are the most flexible seem to be the most successful. So if people are attached to the concept of it has to be my platform and this exact data fed to me in this exact way, it's really hard because that's limiting. But if you have those that say, this is the methodology, but I'm open to it, being on a platform with another one who's maybe even my competitor or, done therapeutically or in a cloud. But I think you have to really be willing to be flexible and not attached to your exact technology, because that's not going to work for everybody. It's really about the process, not the thing.
Yeah, I think that's something that all of us are realizing with experience. Dr. Mario, what's your response to the question?
Yeah, I think I totally agree. Interoperability. Also, think about the role of even things like predictive analytics. Is there a tool that can sit on top of the data and being able to call out, again, who are, your high risk for a certain, diagnoses or events or things that, again, aren't overly cumbersome or complex, or where we have to be reliant on, our EMRs to be able to redesign. So interoperability and, solutions, I think, really will create, much more successful transactions.
Wonderful. So I think that brings us to another underlying theme for this summit. We're hearing pretty much across all sessions that the transformation is on, and one of the reasons for that is digital and technology, right? And we are seeing tremendous amount of technology innovation in this space. EHRs are becoming more and more open. Bill, you talked about API-based architectures, a lot of consumerized applications. So from your standpoint, what do you see the role of technology and digital in this transformation around patient access? What are you most excited about in the technology space in times to come?
Well, I'm definitely excited about the ability to share data across stakeholders and bring it together, because as you teed up at the start of this panel, patient access is that point in time in a patient's journey where multiple stakeholders have to come together to create that access. So I'm really excited about that. I'm also excited, and again, my worldview today is on the preventative health side, that our company is really focused on women's preventative health. So I'm excited about the increasing role of companies that are digital native, that live in the world of consumerism, that know how to appeal and streamline consumers' experience, and their increasing interest in and focus on healthcare, because I think that we have to recognize the different roles we play, and we're competing for a patient's time or a consumer's time, depending on where they are in their healthcare journey. So I'm excited about those technologies and companies that really have consumer DNA and can drive improvement from that perspective.
Wonderful. Myla, from your perspective?
I'm really excited about how we're leveraging tools and technologies to find previously unrecognized risk factors for different diseases. That's, all of the AI and machine learning, but there's so much we already know, yet there's so much we don't know that really would help us treat patients better, maybe predict if they're not going to adhere, predict if a medicine won't work. We're working with a company now that does exactly that based on genomic sequencing. They can predict the likelihood of a drug working. That's amazing if we can definitely figure that out. So I think those are all the things that are going to help us, first of all, find patients we might be missing today that need therapies, but also ensure we're aligning the right therapies with the right patients and not having as much, not just wasted money, but wasted time of them being on the wrong product.
Yeah, I think that's very important. That's tremendously important. Dr. Maria, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I'm excited about the patient engagement side. We haven't been particularly successful with disease management and care management outreach. The ROI has been quite poor when you think about how much resources we typically pour into it and how inefficient the process is. So, especially since 50% of chronic conditions are driven by poor lifestyle choices, I think we need more behavioral solutions to what are behavioral problems, and also then network access challenges. We talked about Myla brought up social determinants of health, but how do we integrate behavioral health with physical health? How do we deal with network access challenges, with specialty access challenges, in addition to social determinants? So I'm excited in terms of this digital transformation and being able to increase access to professionals and to be able to do this scalable and for patients in the home.
Yeah, I think that you all covered the most important aspects that we also have been hearing throughout this session, throughout the summit: data, patient engagement, analytics to drive better decision making and understand trends and patterns that are hidden. So with that, I think we are towards the end of the panel questions, but I have a lot of questions that my team has shared with me from the audience side, and I'll try and cover these questions in the time that we have. So this question is for Dr. Maria. You talked about the topic of copay. So manufacturers have begun sponsoring copay programs to help patients manage their OP expenses. However, with copay maximizers, accumulators coming into play, what impacts on patients are you seeing? So that's a question for you.
Yes. Well, first of all, I think, certainly these are beneficial because without them, patients wouldn't be able to afford and stay on medications. My opinion with copay maximizers is a more favorable one because you're spreading out the value of the copay assistance over a year. And so, it facilitates patient adherence over that period as opposed to kind of a start and stop when patients run out of copay assistance. But I think they're absolutely critical. And also in specialty, there's a level of control from the payer. So it often feels like, we're on the same side in terms of helping the right patient that we also deem to be medically appropriate for the therapy to stay on the drug.
Mm-hmm. Myla, any perspective from your side on this?
I definitely agree with all of that. I mean, certainly the copay cards, all of that is really important. We can't not have them, but I do think we have to figure out how we make sure that the right patients get them. I mean, I think about all the times you're at the pharmacy and you hear somebody saying, hey, did you know this? What, there was this card. I mean, not everybody's as savvy as we are and know to ask or look it up. We don't know everyone. Certainly I tell every neighbor I can think of or family member, but we've got to figure out ways to make it more broad for people that have a different level of health literacy.
Wonderful. So another question that has popped up is, what are your thoughts on this, the inconsistency in coverage and decision-making by payers across numerous drug classes and disease states? Evidence requirement for these decisions frequently differ between governmental and commercial entities. How do you think a pharma should address that?
I can chime in on this. I mean, we actually hold a lot of qualitative forums on this exact topic. And I don't know if it's inconsistency of evidence needed. I think that it's more not getting enough information prior to creating your research and outcomes platform. I know when I was at Merck, we would always meet the requirements that are needed to bring a product to market, which are 2 non-inferiority trials, placebo-controlled, double-blinded, but we didn't always launch with outcomes information. Then we would get out in the market and we would find out, oh, wait, these are the things that the payers care about. These are the things that providers care about. And then we had to go back and get it. I think if there was a little more insight generation done prior to creating the entire research platform, then people wouldn't be left scrambling to get additional information later.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think there is this missed opportunity early on, phase 2 development even, to have a conversation with a payer, to try to understand what's in the mind of the payer as they're making decisions. And frankly, where the puck is going in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, not just what does it look like today, but anticipate what that's going to look like so that, again, we have the endpoints that we're going to need at the time of product launch or device launch to make the right decisions.
Wonderful. So there's another question, and this can be a tricky question to answer. So what opportunity can biopharma consider to capitalize on the technology innovations that specialty pharmacies are adopting? Do you foresee a situation where pharma can choose between hub versus a specialty pharmacy, and even probably going to the extent of doing away with hubs and just relying on specialty pharmacy to create patient support services? Myla, probably you would be in the best position to respond to this.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely know there's a lot that goes on through the specialty pharmacy. I do think that can be limiting. I mean, Premier used to own 2 specialty pharmacies. It's a very tough business to manage. So I think that's just a really tough one. I don't know, I would welcome others to chime in on that.
It's a business decision. Certainly, if you're trying to improve adherence, the specialty model tends to do that. There are more touch points with patients. They also have the ability to collect, I wouldn't say all data, but some data, which is important, especially for REMS programs and maybe even, adherence related patterns. But I would actually advise to be flexible rather than to think of one size fits all, because it is a much more expensive proposition.
Right. And there is another interesting one where we talk about technology being a solution to many of the challenges that we are talking about. But do you see a stage where pharma can collaborate with healthcare to leverage their assets and technology? I'm sure all of you have perspectives on this. So, Bill, why don't we go with you first and then go around the table?
Apologies, Nitin. The question is how pharma can collaborate with
healthcare to leverage their assets and technology. They have a lot of data. They have their own systems, EHRs, and others. How can they collaborate?
Well, I think there's a number of ways to collaborate. Certainly under the innovation umbrella and innovation programs, and depending on the size of the organization, the provider organization, they'll have resources and people that are tasked to drive those agendas and create value in new ways on behalf of patients. So I think that's one forum. I do think as it relates to the technology community, there have been a number of ways to think more expansively about bringing together that patient journey across the different steps as it relates to the pharma side. And so I've seen programs in place, and I think that it's a matter of exploring different companies and different stakeholders and seeing where the opportunities lie. But more and more of the industry is recognizing that the systems and approaches that work well or were put in place, I should say, over the last number of years are not the same systems that are going to carry us forward in this much more connected, much more analytical, predictive-driven environment.
Right. Myla, your perspective on this question?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything Bill said is right. I mean, part of it is how you leverage their technologies to pilot programs. But then I think there's the other side of how do you consume all of the data coming out of the technologies that these health systems have. And there's plenty of companies, we're one of them, and there's plenty of others that are bringing this data in and making it consumable and usable and actionable. And so that's part of it too. It's not just how you leverage it to get into the system, but it's how you leverage those insights to then create programs that can be used to improve products or get the right drugs in front of the right patient. So there's a lot of bi-directional ability with that.
Right. And Dr. Maria, your experience, your prediction on how these things can be leveraged together?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I also think of, are there more willing partners? And, perhaps the ability to even, think about innovation and joint ventures for the mutual benefit of both organizations, right? So, and also where pharma may also have an easier time, or device companies may have an easier time in demonstrating their value in terms of total cost of care impact, when you have a broader data set, including EMR, and where you also have medical pharmacy claims and can also develop even strategic pilots where you're trying to answer a very specific question related to value and the impact on care delivery and total cost. So I totally agree. Also a great opportunity to think about risk, right? I mean, if there's programs or best practices that really are a partnership involves, a mutual commitment to, defining best practices, but also defining the elements of success and going at risk for that, or shared savings.
Right. Now, there's just one last question that we see giant pharma companies adopting branded generic models with with their patents expiring, they're moving into branded generics. Against that backdrop, more and more product pipelines are getting narrower, and we may see creative, innovative access programs. So what do you see in the times to come, pharma going, with that particular backdrop? How do you see these patient programs in the future? From a branded generic perspective.
Well, I think one aspect is that there are more avenues to establish relationships directly with patients and consumers and create value. Now, I know our marketplace is quite fragmented, and that challenge is a reality, but pharma is in a great position with a lot of capabilities to create awareness and to bring additional value-added services directly to consumers. And so given that question, I would be thinking about, what are not just from a branding marketing standpoint, but thinking about that patient journey and what are the other ways in which value can be added directly from the manufacturer to the consumer and create that relationship, which, again, going back to 21st Century Cures Act and some of the other interoperability and other initiatives, these are part of a broader trend to empower healthcare consumers and achieve those broader outcomes for our overall system. So I think it's very much in line with the spirit of those trends in our market.
Anybody else would like to comment on this?
Yeah, I would agree. I also think that, again, as a payer, we usually think net, right? So we think of the WAC cost, we think of, we talked about transparency, but we also think about, what is the net impact, and, where is the product going to be tiered? I do agree with Bill that in the end, if there's value to the consumer in terms of not just convenience, but maybe some of the impact on the patient-reported outcomes and that matter to patients, right? So, but then it's more of a, the consumer willingness to pay, perhaps, right? If the drug's excluded.
Wonderful. So I guess I'm getting a closeout signal from my backing team. We are towards the end of the time. So I thank you for your time today. It's been really a privilege. I've learned a lot today in the answers that you provided. Thank you so much, Bill, Maria, and Myla. It's been a great session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.